we take a look at what the governor did yesterday in terms of yet another veto of yet another piece of legislation coming from the State House and the State Senate here in Pennsylvania. With us this morning is a member of the State House. He is Mike Jones of the 93rd Legislative District right here in the York County area. And, Mike, good morning. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing well. Good morning, Gary.
Well, great to have you in this morning. But yesterday, the governor dashed the hopes of people, thinking that maybe the locals would be in total charge of those numbers of 250 outdoors and making rules for fans and so forth, when he vetoed legislation that came from you in the state Senate. Talk a little bit about that and the fact that you're now going to kind of mount an effort to override that veto.
Yeah, that's correct, Gary. And I would start by pointing out to folks that I think just over a week ago now, we had a great ruling from a federal judge as opposed to our activist Supreme Court here in Pennsylvania. Federal judge in Western Pennsylvania, Judge Stickman, ruled these same requirements, the 25 indoor and 250 outdoor, to be unconstitutional. Now, the governor's seeking a stay in that, but I don't believe that's been granted yet. So those have been ruled unconstitutional. You think that would have given him a little pause in choosing to veto this, but unfortunately not the case. We did have the votes when we passed it,
right.
A veto-proof majority, but I want to remind people, because you pass a bill with a veto-proof majority,
right.
The governor can still veto it, and you got to go back to the well. So we're hoping to override the veto, but we're concerned. There's always the concern that some people, the Democrats, may rally the wagons and circle the wagons and change their votes. But hopefully, we'll have the votes to override.
One of the things that's been interesting to me, Mike, has been the reaction to, and I mentioned this earlier in the show, the reaction to the judge's ruling, Judge Stickman's ruling, compared to the rules that the governor laid down. And so essentially, tell me if I'm wrong on this, the governor's or the judge's ruling basically, if you look at it one way and say, well, I could just say, hey, anybody's welcome now. I mean, those rules don't apply because in this particular case, and again, a narrow look at this, the 250 and 25 don't apply. And yet it seems like most people have kept those rules in place despite the ruling by Judge Stickman. I was a little confused by that. Did you have any of the same confusion that I had?
Yeah, it's really been a source of frustration, various examples, this being the latest, where people seem to view the governor as if he's some sort of dictator. And you're correct. I think part of that is that we as legislators, there's been a few examples. Another big example was when we passed the resolution 836 to end this thing back in June. We should have immediately taken to the Capitol steps and declared, at that point, that the emergency had been revoked. In this case, we ought to be bringing more attention to it and saying, hey, these are unconstitutional. They don't apply anymore. That's certainly true in the 24 counties in the Western District, and I think the legal folks I've talked to would say it's pretty safe to assume you could make that declaration in the whole state right now, unless the stay is granted, which may happen while he appeals that case.
The thing that concerns me, I think, is, and again, I discussed this earlier in the show, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, that what is, if the governor invokes this right now as an emergency, which he's done, and the governor says, I am the one that's going to make the rules, not the state legislature, which normally is the one that makes the laws, and the governor has to approve those or veto them. If, let's say the flu gets really bad this year or next year, and maybe COVID becomes kind of yesterday's news, does the governor then get the right to lay that down again? Knowing what we know now, I'm sure probably there'd be a little bit more pushback right from the beginning from the legislature, and yet at the same time, the governor has gained quite a bit of power during this particular time and seems to be able to slap off any kind of efforts by the state legislature. Obviously, you've got a state Supreme Court that's in his corner, 5-2. They're Democrats versus Republicans. So when you look at that, if the governor has the court in his corner, guess what? The legislature gets left out in the cold primarily, don't they?
Yeah, it's a really, really scary precedent here, and I think as I've shared on your show, and you just articulated very well, the idea that the ruling when the Supreme Court said that he was allowed to veto that the resolution we passed that I referenced. It's exactly what you said. In theory and really in practice, which we're living, the governor can come in, declare a state of emergency for any number of things that he or she deems appropriate. And as long as you've got just 1/3 of one of the houses of the legislature, one of the chambers, to prevent overriding a veto, they could rule effectively as a dictator. People ought to be up in arms over this. I mean, it's crazy. And you think of all of the different things that you could declare an emergency declaration. You probably are aware, but a lot of folks may not know. We've been under an emergency declaration since 2018 relative to the opioid crisis, which is a legitimate crisis, but does not warrant an emergency declaration that's ongoing for multiple years. It's scary stuff. We do want to. There's a bill we had passed. I think there's a lot of lessons learned here. One is that the governor, we've got to set a timeline. The bill that made it through the House, I forget the number and the author of it, but I think it set it at 21 days that he would in the future have to come back to the legislature for approval. Another thing I want to get on people's radar screen, Russ Diamond, I believe it is, has a bill that would we've got to stop. It sounds good in theory, but electing judges is a bad idea. There's a reason Supreme Court justices are appointed, vetted, and approved. He's got a novel approach where we would still elect them, but we would break the state into 7 districts. If you look historically, virtually all, it's a remarkable number, virtually all Supreme Court justices in Pennsylvania have hailed from either Philadelphia or Allegheny County. I think you got to go back to the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s to find a single Supreme Court judge from York County, for example. I believe that's true.